Sometimes life deals you a hand so cruel that even strangers feel sorry for you. When 54-year-old Eli Morgan inherited nothing but a crumbling homestead and old dog, the whole town laughed at his misfortune. This weathered cowboy had spent 30 years working cattle, with nothing to show but worn hands and bent back. Now he was stuck with rotting boards and loyal shepherd named Bo. But sometimes the cruelest jokes hide the greatest blessings. When Bo started digging in the same spot every day, Eli discovered something that would change everything. What he found buried in that forgotten corner would make those laughing neighbors come back. What does a man do when sudden wealth threatens his only friendship? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered by a dusty rider who'd asked twice if he had the right man. Eli Morgan had read it standing in the bunkhouse doorway, squinting at the formal script that seemed too fancy for his calloused fingers. His uncle Josiah had died, leaving him a homestead in Montana territory. The lawyer's words were polite but clear. No one else had claimed the inheritance. Eli had folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and finished his last roundup for the Double Bar Ranch. 30 years of working other men's cattle, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, eating beans from other men's cookfires. At 54, his back ached in the mornings, and his knees protested when he mounted a horse. The inheritance felt like providence, even if he couldn't quite remember Uncle Josiah's face. The stagecoach had dropped him at Copper Falls, a town that consisted of one main street, 2 saloons, a general store, and a church that looked like it had seen better days. The banker, a thin man named Caldwell with nervous hands, had given him directions to the homestead, along with a set of rusty keys and what he called a realistic assessment of the property's condition. "Your uncle was a peculiar man," Caldwell had said, adjusting his spectacles. "Lived alone out there for near 20 years, kept to himself mostly. The place has been empty since he passed." The ride out had taken most of the afternoon, following a wagon trail that wound through rolling grassland dotted with sage and buffalo grass. The Montana skies stretched endlessly overhead, painted with clouds that threw moving shadows across the prairie. Eli had felt his spirits lift despite the banker's warnings. This was big country, the kind a man could lose himself in if he had a mind to. The homestead sat in a shallow valley between 2 gentle rises, sheltered from the worst winds but open to the southern sun. From a distance, it looked almost picturesque, a small cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that still held most of its roof, and what appeared to be a root cellar built into the hillside. But as Eli had drawn closer, the reality became clear. The cabin's roof sagged in the middle like a sway-backed horse. Half the windows were broken, stuffed with rags and newspaper. The front porch tilted at an alarming angle, its support posts rotted through at the base. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation, and what had once been a garden was now an explosion of wild grass and volunteer trees. The barn was in better shape, but not by much. The doors hung askew on rusted hinges, and pigeons had taken up residence in the loft. A few chickens scratched around the yard, apparently forgotten, but managing to survive on their own. The whole place had the air of a dream deferred, of plans that had run out of time and money, but it was the dog that had surprised him most. Bo was a shepherd mix, grey around the muzzle, but still sturdy in the chest and shoulders. He'd appeared from behind the barn as Eli dismounted, tail wagging cautiously, eyes alert and intelligent. The dog had approached slowly, sniffing at Eli's boots and hands, before allowing a gentle pat on the head. There was something almost ceremonial about the meeting, as if Bo had been waiting specifically for him. "Well, boy," Eli had murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Looks like we're both stuck with this place." The cabin's interior was a museum of loneliness. Josiah had lived simply. A narrow bed, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with books that surprised Eli with their sophistication. Poetry by Longfellow, essays by Emerson, even a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's plays. On the mantelpiece sat a daguerreotype of a stern-faced woman Eli didn't recognize, along with what appeared to be mining tools in miniature, a tiny pickaxe, a small pan, a model of a rocker box. The kitchen held basic supplies that hadn't spoiled, flour in a sealed tin, coffee beans, salt pork wrapped in oilcloth. Someone, probably a neighbor, had been checking on the place, keeping the worst of the rot at bay. Eli had made coffee with water from the well, which ran clear and cold, and sat on the tilted porch watching the sun set behind the western hills. That first night, Bo had slept on the porch, positioned so he could see both the approach to the cabin and a particular spot in the yard near the root cellar. Eli had noticed the dog's attention to that area, but thought little of it. Dogs had their own mysteries, their own reasons for favoring certain places. The next morning had brought visitors. Thomas Brennan owned the largest spread in the valley, and he'd ridden over with two of his hands to welcome the new neighbor. Brennan was a big man with a voice to match, accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He'd looked around the homestead with undisguised amusement. "So you're Josiah's nephew," he'd said, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you came all the way from Colorado to claim this palace." His men had laughed at that, and Eli had felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being the butt of someone else's joke. He'd spent too many years being the oldest hand, the one who got the worst horses and the night watches no one wanted. "Place needs work," Eli had admitted. "Work?" Brennan had snorted. "Son, this place needs a miracle, or a match and a good wind." More neighbors had come by over the following days. The Hendersons from the adjoining property, curious and kind, but clearly doubtful about Eli's prospects. The Kowalski brothers from downstream, who'd offered to buy the water rights for a price that seemed insulting even to Eli's inexperienced ears. Mrs. Carruthers from town, ostensibly bringing a basket of bread, but really wanting to see the poor soul who'd inherited Josiah's folly. Each visit had reinforced the same message. He was a figure of pity at best, entertainment at worst. The homestead was worthless, the land played out, the buildings beyond salvage. A smart man would sell what he could and move on, but Eli had nowhere to move on to. His savings amounted to $67 and change. He owned his horse, his saddle, 2 changes of clothes, and a rifle that had seen better days. At 54, he was too old to start over somewhere else and too proud to go crawling back to the Double Bar Ranch, so he'd started making repairs. The work was slow going. His back complained about the lifting, and his knees protested the kneeling, but the rhythm of physical labor was familiar and comforting. He'd straightened the porch posts with scrap lumber, patched the worst holes in the roof with shingles salvaged from the barn, and cleared the weeds from around the foundation. Bo had helped, in his way. The dog seemed to understand that this was his home now, too, and he'd taken to following Eli around the property, alert for snakes and warning of approaching visitors with a low bark that carried just the right note of caution. But there was one thing about Bo that puzzled Eli. Every morning, without fail, the dog would trot over to the same spot in the yard, a patch of ground near the root cellar where the grass grew thin and the soil looked darker than the surrounding earth. Bo would circle the area, sniff intently, and then begin to dig. Not frantically, but with purpose, as if he knew something was down there. Eli would call him off, not wanting holes all over the yard, and Bo would obey. But the next morning, he'd be back at the same spot, pawing at the earth with the patience of a creature who had all the time in the world. "What's got you so interested in that patch, boy?" Eli would ask, but Bo would just look at him with those intelligent brown eyes and wag his tail. The dog's behavior was just one more mystery in a life that had suddenly become full of them. But in the golden light of a Montana evening, with Bo stretched out beside him on the porch and the sound of the wind through the grass, Eli found himself thinking that maybe mysteries weren't such a bad thing to have. 3 weeks into his residency at the homestead, Eli was beginning to think the neighbors might be right about needing a miracle. The October mornings carried a bite that warned of winter coming. and he'd managed to patch only the most critical holes in the cabin's roof. The barn still leaked like a sieve, and the root cellar door had warped so badly it wouldn't close properly. He'd spent the morning trying to repair the chicken coop, coaxing the few remaining hens back into what passed for shelter. The work was frustrating. Every board he straightened revealed two more that were rotted beyond saving. His knuckles were scraped raw, and his patience was wearing thin when Bo started his daily ritual. The dog trotted over to his favorite spot, with the same purposeful gait he'd shown every morning since Eli's arrival. 20 feet from the root cellar, in a patch where the grass grew sparse and the soil had a different color, darker, richer somehow, Bo began his careful inspection, nose to the ground, circling the area with scientific precision. "Not today, boy," Eli called from the chicken coop. "I've got enough holes to worry about." But Bo ignored him, which was unusual. The dog had been obedient to a fault, responding immediately to every command. Today, something was different. Bo began to dig with an intensity Eli hadn't seen before, his powerful shoulders working as he threw dirt behind him in steady rhythm. "Bo, leave it." The dog paused, looked back at Eli with what could only be described as reproach, and resumed digging with even greater determination. Eli set down his hammer and walked over, intending to pull the dog away by his collar. But as he approached, he noticed something that made him stop short. The hole Bo had excavated was deeper than usual, and at the bottom, barely visible through the loose earth, was something that definitely wasn't a root or a rock, the edge of what looked like rotted wood. Eli knelt beside the hole, his heart picking up speed. "What have you found, boy?" Bo stepped back, tail wagging, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Eli brushed away the loose dirt with his hands, revealing more of the wooden edge. It was definitely man-made, a straight line where nature would have made curves, corners where there should have been random shapes. Working carefully, Eli used his fingers to clear more soil. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but it held together. As he worked, the shape became clearer. A rectangular box, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, buried perhaps 3 feet down. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone had buried this deliberately, choosing a spot that was unremarkable but specific. Someone who wanted it hidden but recoverable. Someone who might have trusted a loyal dog to remember where it was buried. Uncle Josiah. Eli's hands trembled as he dug faster, using a piece of broken board from the chicken coop to scrape away larger amounts of earth. Bo supervised the operation with the satisfied air of a teacher, whose slow student had finally grasped an important lesson. The chest, for that's what it clearly was, came free after 20 minutes of careful excavation. It was heavier than its size suggested, dense with whatever lay inside. The wood was oak, Eli thought, chosen for its resistance to rot. Iron bands reinforced the corners. Though rust had claimed most of the metal, a simple iron clasp held the lid closed, secured with what had once been a small padlock. But years of moisture had done their work, and the lock crumbled when Eli touched it, leaving only rust stains on his fingers. He lifted the chest out of the hole and set it on level ground. Bo sat beside him, watching intently as if he understood the magnitude of this moment. The chest felt solid, substantial, promising. But promises had been broken before. Eli took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The afternoon sun slanted across the contents, transforming them into something that didn't seem quite real. Gold coins caught the light and threw it back in warm yellow gleams. Silver bars nestled against leather pouches that clinked softly when the wind stirred them. And beneath it all, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the decades, papers that looked official and important. For a long moment, Eli simply stared. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, to connect the reality of treasure with the poverty he'd known all his life. This was the stuff of children's stories, of dime novels and campfire tales. It wasn't supposed to be real, but it was real. He could feel the weight of the coins when he picked one up, could see the detail of their stamping, could smell the metallic scent of precious metals that had been buried longer than he'd been alive. With shaking hands, he lifted out one of the leather pouches. Inside were more gold coins, different from the first ones he'd seen. These bore the marks of private mints, the kind used in mining camps where federal currency was scarce. He counted 27 coins in the first pouch alone. The silver bars were stamped with markings he didn't recognize, symbols, and numbers that meant nothing to him, but everything to someone who understood such things. There were 6 bars, each one heavier than it looked, each one representing more money than he'd ever seen in one place. But it was the papers that made his hands shake the most. Wrapped in the oiled cloth were documents written in Josiah's careful hand. The first was a letter addressed to my heir, whoever you may be. The ink had faded, but was still readable in the late afternoon light. The letter explained everything and nothing. Josiah had been a mining engineer before he'd become a hermit. He'd worked claims throughout Colorado and Montana, always taking payment in gold and silver rather than paper money that might lose its value. He'd saved everything, trusted no banks, kept his wealth portable and hidden, but there was more. The papers included deeds and claim certificates, land grants and mineral rights. Property scattered across 3 territories, some of it apparently quite valuable if Josiah's notes were accurate. One document in particular caught Eli's attention. A deed to a silver mine in Colorado that Josiah claimed was currently producing and profitable under lease agreement. Eli read the letter twice, then carefully rewrapped everything and placed it back in the chest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. But he felt wide awake, more alert than he'd been in years. Bo nudged his elbow gently, and Eli scratched the dog's ears with automatic affection. "You knew, didn't you, boy? All this time, you knew what was down there." The dog's tail wagged in what Eli could only interpret as agreement. Standing up was more difficult than usual. His knees had stiffened during the excavation, and the magnitude of what he'd discovered seemed to add physical weight to every movement. He picked up the chest, surprised again by its heft, and carried it toward the cabin. Inside, by lamplight, he conducted a more thorough inventory. There were over 200 gold coins of various denominations and origins. The silver bars alone were worth more than he'd earned in the past 5 years. And the papers, if they were legitimate, and he had no reason to doubt Josiah's careful record-keeping, represented wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined. According to Josiah's notes, the total value of the buried treasure and associated properties was somewhere in the neighborhood of what the letter called $10 million. Give or take the fluctuations of precious metal markets, $10 million. Eli set the papers down and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. Tomorrow everything would be different. Tomorrow he would no longer be the poor relation who'd inherited a worthless homestead. He would be rich beyond the dreams of anyone in Copper Falls, wealthier than Thomas Brennan or any of the other big ranchers who'd looked at him with pity and amusement. But tonight he was still just a man and his dog, sitting in a drafty cabin on a patch of Montana prairie, trying to understand how completely the world had changed. Bo settled down beside his chair, satisfied with the day's work. The dog had done his job, had preserved his master's secret until the right person came along to claim it. Now he could rest, knowing that the treasure Josiah had entrusted to his care was finally in the hands it belonged to. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and whistling through the gaps in the walls. But inside, Eli felt warmer than he had in years. Eli spent the night sitting at Josiah's old table, the treasure spread before him like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Sleep seemed impossible when every few minutes he had to touch one of the gold coins to convince himself it was real. By dawn, he'd read through all of Josiah's papers 3 times, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited. The mining claim in Colorado was the most intriguing piece. According to the documents, Josiah had leased it to a company called Mountain State Silver for 25 years, with the lease set to expire next spring. The annual payments were supposed to be $5,000, sent care of the Copper Falls Bank. Eli made a mental note to visit Caldwell and ask about any mail that might have accumulated. But first, he needed to hide the treasure properly. The chest's original burial spot was compromised now, and leaving such wealth sitting on a kitchen table seemed like tempting fate. He spent the morning exploring the root cellar, finally settling on a spot behind a stack of preserving jars where he could dig into the packed earth wall. Bo supervised the operation with the same intensity he'd shown during the original excavation. The dog seemed to understand that this was important business, requiring careful attention to detail. When Eli had created a cavity large enough to hold the chest, Bo sniffed around the edges, apparently approving of the location. "What do you think, boy? Good enough to fool any visitors?" Bo's tail wagged, which Eli chose to interpret as professional endorsement. Concealing the disturbed earth took another hour. Eli scattered the extra dirt throughout the root cellar, rearranged the preserve jars to look natural, and even dragged some old burlap sacks over the area. By the time he finished, even he had trouble spotting exactly where he'd been digging. The physical work helped calm his nerves, but it couldn't quiet the questions spinning through his mind. What was he supposed to do with $10 million? How did a man even begin to handle that kind of money? And more importantly, who could he trust with the knowledge? His first instinct was to tell no one, but that seemed impractical. Some of Josiah's investments required active management. The mining lease alone would need attention when it expired, and the gold and silver would have to be converted to usable currency eventually, which meant dealing with banks and lawyers and other people who asked uncomfortable questions. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his worrying. Through the kitchen window, he could see 3 riders coming up the valley, Thomas Brennan and 2 of his hands. The same group that had welcomed him 3 weeks ago. Eli met them on the porch, trying to look like a man whose biggest concern was whether the chickens were laying eggs. Bo positioned himself at Eli's side, not threatening but clearly alert. "Morning, Morgan," Brennan called out, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you've been doing some improvements around here." "Some," Eli admitted. "Place needed work." "Work's one thing," said one of Brennan's hands, a young man named Curtis, who had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "But we heard you were digging around behind the house. Mighty curious thing for a man to be doing when there's so much else needs fixing." Eli felt his chest tighten. In a community this small, news traveled fast, and apparently someone had noticed his excavation. He glanced at Bo, who was watching the visitors with the calm attention of a dog who knew his master's secrets. "Dog kept digging in the same spot," Eli said, which was true enough. "Finally decided to see what had him so interested. Find anything interesting?" Brennan asked, and there was something in his tone that made Eli's instincts sharpen. "Old bottles, mostly. Some rusted tin cans. Josiah apparently used that spot for trash." Curtis leaned forward in his saddle. "Funny thing about old Josiah. Man lived alone for 20 years. Never seemed to have much money, but he never wanted for anything either. Always paid his bills on time, always had cash when he needed it. Some folks are careful with their money," Eli said. "Careful's one thing," Brennan said. "But there were rumors about that old man. Stories about where he came from, what he might have brought with him." The conversation was heading in a direction that made Eli uncomfortable. These men hadn't ridden out here just to pass the time. They were fishing for information, and that meant someone had been talking. "If there were any stories worth telling," Eli said carefully, "I imagine I would have heard them by now." Brennan studied him for a long moment, his eyes moving from Eli's face to the freshly filled hole near the root cellar. "Maybe, or maybe you're the kind of man who keeps things to himself." "In my experience," Eli said, "most things worth keeping are worth keeping quiet about." That earned him a sharp look from Curtis, but Brennan actually smiled. "Smart philosophy. Man can get himself in trouble talking too much about his business, or other people's business," Eli added. "True enough." Brennan gathered his reins. "Well, we'll let you get back to your improvements. But if you ever need advice about handling valuable property, feel free to ask. I've got experience with that kind of thing." They rode away at an easy pace, but Eli noticed that Curtis kept looking back over his shoulder. When they were out of sight, Eli sat down heavily on the porch steps, his hands shaking slightly, Bo pressed against his leg, offering comfort in the way only dogs could. "They know something, boy," Eli murmured. "Maybe not what, but they know something's different." The visit had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. In the space of a few minutes, his secret had gone from being completely safe to feeling dangerously exposed. If Brennan was asking questions, other people would be asking them too. And sooner or later, someone would ask the right question of the right person. He needed help, but who could he trust? Caldwell at the bank seemed honest enough, but bankers talked to other bankers. Mrs. Carruthers was kind, but she was also the town's unofficial source of news and gossip. The Hendersons were good neighbors, but they had teenage sons who might not be careful with exciting information. That afternoon, Eli made a decision that surprised him. He saddled his horse and rode into town, ostensibly to buy supplies, but really to test the waters. He needed to know how much people were talking and what they were saying. The general store was busy with the usual afternoon crowd, farmers picking up necessities, ranch hands spending their pay, women discussing the weather and their neighbors' business. Eli bought coffee and bacon, salt and sugar, keeping his ears open for any mention of his name or unusual activity at the old homestead. What he heard made his blood run. "Cold," saw Morgan digging around behind his places. Brennan thinks the old man might have left something valuable, always. Said Josiah was hiding money somewhere. The speculation was already spreading, growing and changing with each telling. By next week, the story would probably have him finding everything from Spanish gold to buried Confederate silver. And with each retelling, more people would become interested in taking a closer look at what he was really doing out there. Riding home in the gathering dusk, Eli realized that finding the treasure had been the easy part. Keeping it and staying alive long enough to enjoy it was going to be considerably more challenging. Bo trotted alongside his horse, alert to every shadow and sound. The dog understood that something had changed in their quiet world, that the peace they'd enjoyed for 3 weeks was now under threat. By the time they reached the homestead, Eli had made another decision. Tomorrow, he would ride to the county seat and find a lawyer. Not to discuss the treasure, not yet, but to learn about his legal rights and responsibilities. If people were going to come looking for Josiah's secrets, he needed to know exactly where he stood. The treasure would wait. It had waited this long already. The ride to Helena took most of the day, following roads that wound through valleys painted in autumn colors. Eli had left before dawn, instructing Bo to stay at the homestead and watch for visitors. The dog had seemed to understand the importance of the mission, taking up position on the porch where he could observe both the approach road and the root cellar. Helena was bigger than Copper Falls, a proper city with brick buildings and paved streets. Eli found the law offices of Henderson and Associates, no relation to his neighbors, in a 3-story building near the courthouse. The lawyer who agreed to see him was a woman named Sarah Henderson, which surprised him. In his experience, lady lawyers were about as common as snowflakes in July. "Mr. Morgan," she said, gesturing to a chair in her office. "What brings you to Helena?" Sarah Henderson was perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. Her office was lined with law books and legal documents, creating an atmosphere of serious competence that put Eli somewhat at ease. "I inherited some property recently," he began carefully. "Homestead near Copper Falls. I'm trying to understand my legal position if someone were to dispute the inheritance. Do you have reason to believe someone might contest it?" Eli chose his words carefully. The previous owner lived alone for 20 years. Some folks seemed to think he might have had property or assets that weren't included in the will. "I want to know where I stand if people start making claims." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Do you have the will and inheritance documents?" Eli produced the papers Caldwell had given him, along with the letter from the lawyer who'd originally contacted him. Sarah read through everything with professional thoroughness, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This appears straightforward," she said finally. Your uncle's will specifically leaves all property, real and personal, wherever located, to his closest living relative. That's you. Unless someone can prove they have a superior claim, which would be difficult given the language here. Everything he owned is legally yours, even things that might not have been specifically mentioned in the will, especially those things. The phrase, all property personal, is deliberately broad. It includes anything your uncle owned at the time of his death, whether it was listed in an inventory or not. Eli felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. What if someone claims he owed them money or had agreements that weren't recorded? Creditors would have to prove their claims with documentation. Verbal agreements are notoriously difficult to enforce, especially when one party is deceased. However, she added, leaning forward slightly, if you discover assets of significant value, I'd recommend having them properly appraised and documented. For insurance purposes, if nothing else, what would constitute significant value? Anything worth more than a few $100s should be recorded. If we're talking about really substantial assets, thousands of dollars or more, there might be tax implications to consider. Eli managed to keep his expression neutral. I'll keep that in mind. The consultation cost him $5, which seemed reasonable for the peace of mind it provided. Sarah Henderson gave him her card and told him to contact her if any complications arose. As he left Helena, Eli felt more confident about his legal position, but he also realized he was going to need more professional help than he'd anticipated. The ride home gave him time to think about next steps. He needed to have the treasure properly appraised, which meant finding experts he could trust. He needed to understand the tax implications Sarah had mentioned, and he needed to figure out how to access his wealth without attracting the wrong kind of attention. By the time he reached the homestead, the sun was setting and Bo was waiting anxiously on the porch. The dog's behavior immediately told Eli that something was wrong. Instead of his usual enthusiastic greeting, Bo was alert and tense, his attention focused on the area around the root cellar. "What is it, boy?" Bo led him to the side of the house, where fresh hoofprints in the soft earth told the story. At least 3 horses had been here, their riders dismounting and walking around the property. The prints led to the root cellar, around the barn, and even to the back of the cabin, where windows might offer a view inside. Eli's heart raced as he followed the trail. Someone had taken advantage of his absence to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the property. The question was whether they'd found anything worth their trouble. A quick check of the root cellar showed that his hiding place was undisturbed. The preserve jars were exactly as he'd left them, and the disturbed earth behind them showed no signs of additional digging. But that didn't mean the visitors had gone away empty-handed. Inside the cabin, subtle signs of intrusion were everywhere. His belongings had been searched with professional skill, nothing obviously disturbed. But items weren't quite where he'd left them. Someone had gone through his saddlebags, examined his clothes, and even rifled through Josiah's old books. Most disturbing of all, Josiah's original papers were missing from the kitchen table where Eli had foolishly left them. The inheritance documents, the lawyer's letter, even the property deeds, all gone. Whoever had visited knew exactly what they were looking for. Eli sank into a chair, his mind racing. The situation had escalated far beyond idle neighborhood curiosity. Someone was conducting a serious investigation into Josiah's affairs, and they were professional enough to search a cabin without leaving obvious evidence. Bo pressed against his leg, offering comfort and solidarity. The dog's presence was reassuring, but it also reminded Eli of how vulnerable they both were. If these people were willing to break into his cabin while he was away, what would they do if they discovered the real treasure? That night, Eli slept with his rifle across his knees and Bo alert at the door. Every sound outside, the wind in the eaves, the settling of old wood, the distant call of a coyote, sent adrenaline through his system. This was what wealth felt like, he realized. Not freedom, but a different kind of prison. The next morning brought another unwelcome visitor. Curtis, Brennan's hand, rode up alone just after sunrise. He dismounted without invitation and approached the porch where Eli sat drinking coffee and trying to look like a man without serious worries. "Morning, Morgan. Boss sent me over to check on you." That's neighborly of him. Curtis's smile was predatory. "Funny thing happened yesterday. Someone broke into the Henderson place while they were in town. Went through their house real thorough-like, but didn't take anything valuable. Left behind jewelry, cash, even a nice pocket watch." Eli kept his expression carefully neutral. "That is odd. Makes a man wonder what they were looking for, doesn't it? What kind of burglar passes up easy money to rifle through papers and personal effects?" The implication was clear. The same people who'd searched Eli's cabin had also hit the Hendersons, probably looking for any information about Josiah or his affairs. This wasn't random criminal activity. It was a systematic investigation. "Some folks are strange," Eli said. "Indeed they are." Curtis mounted his horse but didn't immediately leave. "Boss wanted me to mention that if you're having any security concerns, his offer of assistance still stands. Men can't be too careful when there are strange people prowling around the valley." After Curtis left, Eli sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about options and consequences. The message from Brennan was unmistakable: cooperate with us or deal with the mysterious intruders on your own. It was extortion dressed up as neighborly concern, and it meant that Eli's quiet life at the homestead was over. He needed allies, and he needed them quickly. But in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, finding people he could trust was going to be almost impossible. Bo settled beside him on the porch, and Eli scratched the dog's ears while he considered his next move. One thing was certain: he couldn't handle this alone. The treasure that was supposed to solve all his problems had created new ones that were potentially deadly. But giving up wasn't an option either. He'd spent 54 years being poor, being overlooked, being the man who got the worst of everything. Now he had a chance to change that, and he wasn't going to let Thomas Brennan or anyone else scare him away from what was rightfully his. The war for Josiah's legacy had begun, and Eli intended to win it. The decision came to Eli during the sleepless hours before dawn, as he sat by the window watching for shadows that might be more than shadows. He couldn't fight this battle alone, and he couldn't trust anyone in Copper Falls, but there was one person who might help him, someone from his past who understood both loyalty and discretion: Frank. Kozlov had served with Eli during the Indian campaigns of the 1870s. They'd been young soldiers then, learning hard lessons about survival and trust in country that didn't forgive mistakes. Frank had saved Eli's life during a Sioux raid near the Powder River, and Eli had returned the favor 6 months later when Frank took a lance wound that would have been fatal without immediate help. After the army, they'd lost touch, as men often did when civilian life pulled them in different directions. But Eli had heard through mutual acquaintances that Frank had settled in Billings, working as a sheriff's deputy and later as a private investigator. If anyone could help him navigate this situation, it would be Frank. The telegram office in Copper Falls was run by an old man named Peterson, who had a reputation for discretion. Eli composed his message carefully. "Frank Kozlov Billings, stop, need advice on property matter. Stop urgent, stop Eli Morgan." The reply came the next day. "Arriving Saturday. Stop, watch your back. Stop, Frank." Saturday was 3 days away. Eli spent the time making preparations for what he increasingly thought of as a siege. He cleaned and oiled his rifle, checked his ammunition supply, and reinforced the cabin's doors and shutters. Most importantly, he moved the treasure to a new hiding place, this time buried under the barn floor, where casual searchers would be unlikely to look. Bo supervised these activities with the grave attention of a military advisor. The dog seemed to understand that their peaceful interlude was over, that the homestead had become a battlefield where the wrong move could be fatal. The pressure was taking its toll on Eli's nerves. He found himself jumping at ordinary sounds, seeing threats in every visitor or passerby. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now felt like vulnerability. He was a man under siege, and the walls were closing in. Thursday brought another unwelcome development. Mrs. Carruthers arrived with what she called disturbing news and the barely concealed excitement of someone who loved being the bearer of important information. "There are strangers in town," she announced without preamble. "3 men arrived yesterday on the stage. Well-dressed, professional-looking fellows, but they're asking an awful lot of questions about your Uncle Josiah." Eli invited her in for coffee, more to maintain appearances than from genuine hospitality. Mrs. Carruthers settled herself at the kitchen table like a general planning a campaign. "They're staying at the hotel," she continued, "and they've been making rounds, talking to Caldwell at the bank, visiting the old-timers who knew Josiah, even asking about property records at the courthouse." "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual things curious men ask. Where did Josiah come from? What was his financial situation? Did he ever mention family or business interests?" But here's the strange part. They're paying cash for information. Actual money, not just buying drinks or meals. This was worse than Eli had feared. Professional investigators with expense accounts suggested serious backing, probably from people with legal resources and political connections. These weren't local opportunists hoping to stumble onto easy money. These were people who knew what they were looking for. Did anyone tell them anything useful? Mrs. Carruthers leaned forward conspiratorially. "That's just it. Nobody really knew much about Josiah to begin with. He kept to himself, paid his bills, minded his own business. But the more these men ask questions, the more people start remembering little things that seemed unimportant at the time." "What sort of things?" "Well, Caldwell mentioned that Josiah always paid in cash, never used credit or bank drafts. And Mrs. Patterson at the hotel remembered that he once received a package from Colorado that was so heavy it took 2 men to carry it to his wagon." Little details like that, but they add up to a picture. Eli felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Even innocent details could be dangerous when assembled by people who knew how to read between the lines. The strangers were building a profile of Josiah's financial habits, and that profile would inevitably lead them to conclude that he'd had sources of wealth beyond what was visible. "Have they asked about me?" "Oh yes, extensively. They wanted to know everything. How long you've been here, what improvements you've made, whether you've seemed to have money to spend. I told them you were a nice man who worked hard and minded his own business, just like your uncle." "I appreciate that. But I have to say," Mrs. Carruthers added with obvious reluctance, "some folks are starting to wonder if maybe Josiah left more than just the homestead." All this interest from outsiders has people talking. After she left, Eli sat alone in the kitchen, feeling the weight of accumulated pressure. The investigation was closing in from multiple directions. Brennan and his men from the local angle, professional investigators from outside, and now growing suspicion from the community itself. Each day brought new complications, new people asking questions he couldn't answer honestly. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 30 years, he dreamed of having enough money to buy security and independence. Now that he had more wealth than he'd ever imagined, he felt less secure than he had as a poor ranch hand. Money, it seemed, created as many problems as it solved. That evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eli found himself thinking about his father. Samuel Morgan had been a different kind of man, a farmer who'd scraped by on 40 acres of rocky Missouri soil, raising corn and children with equal stubbornness. He'd never had much money, but he'd never seemed to worry about it either. "A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns," Samuel used to say. "It's measured by what he's willing to stand up for." Eli had been 16 when his father died, old enough to understand the lesson, but too young to appreciate its wisdom. Now, 40 years later, he finally grasped what Samuel had been trying to teach him. The treasure buried under his barn wasn't just gold and silver. It was a test of character, a challenge to prove what kind of man he really was. Bo interrupted his reverie by pressing against his leg, offering the kind of comfort that only came from creatures who loved without condition or expectation. The dog had been Josiah's companion for years, had guarded the secret of the treasure with patient loyalty, and now transferred that same devotion to Eli. What do you think, boy? Are we doing the right thing?" Bo's tail wagged once, slowly, and Eli chose to interpret that as approval. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his resolve. But tonight, sitting on the porch of a homestead he'd never wanted with a dog he'd never asked for, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. The treasure had brought danger and complications, but it had also brought him home. For the first time in his adult life, he was fighting for something that was truly his, not just the gold and silver, but the right to determine his own fate. Frank would arrive in 2 days, and together they would figure out how to handle the forces gathering against them. But regardless of what Frank advised, Eli had already made his fundamental decision. He wasn't running away from this fight. Samuel Morgan's son was going to stand his ground. Frank Kozloff arrived on Saturday morning, looking like a man who'd spent 20 years learning hard lessons about human nature. He was still lean and tough, though his dark hair had gone grey at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into too many suspicious shadows. He rode up to the homestead alone, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies that suggested he'd come prepared for an extended stay. "Eli Morgan," he said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who'd taken his share of bullets and knife wounds. "You look like hell." "Feel worse than I look." "Thanks for coming, Frank." They embraced briefly, the way old soldiers did when words weren't adequate for what they'd shared. Bo approached cautiously, sensing that this stranger was somehow different from the others who'd been visiting the homestead. "This the dog you mentioned in your second telegram?" Frank asked, extending his hand for Bo to sniff. "Bo, he belonged to my uncle. Turns out he's got better instincts about people than I do." Bo accepted Frank's presence after a thorough investigation, apparently deciding that anyone Eli trusted deserved preliminary approval. The three of them went inside, where Frank surveyed the cabin with the professional eye of someone who'd spent years assessing defensive positions. "Tell me everything," Frank said, settling into a chair where he could watch both the door and the window. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Eli told the story carefully, beginning with his inheritance and ending with the arrival of the professional investigators. He watched Frank's expression carefully, trying to gauge his old friend's reaction to the magnitude of what they were dealing with. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly letting Eli talk. When the story was finished, he sat silent for several minutes, processing the information with the methodical thoroughness that had made him a good soldier and a better investigator. $10 million, he said, finally, according to Josiah's notes. "And you verified this how?" "I haven't. That's part of the problem. I don't know who to trust with an appraisal." Frank stood and walked to the window, studying the landscape with tactical awareness. "Show me where you buried it." They went to the barn, where Eli revealed his latest hiding place. Frank examined the treasure with professional interest, hefting coins and studying the documents with the attention to detail that came from years of investigating fraud and forgery. "This is legitimate," he said after a thorough examination. "The gold's real, the silver's real, and these documents look authentic. Your uncle wasn't just wealthy, he was smart about how he accumulated and preserved his wealth. So what do I do with it?" "That depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want to be rich, or do you want to stay alive?" The blunt question hung in the air between them. Frank had always been direct about unpleasant realities, a quality that had served them both well during their army years. "I want both," Eli said. "Then we need to be very careful about how we proceed. The people asking questions aren't going away, and they're not amateurs. Someone with serious resources is funding this investigation." Frank spent the afternoon conducting his own reconnaissance, riding around the valley and visiting Copper Falls under the pretense of being Eli's old army buddy come for a visit. He returned at dusk with information that confirmed Eli's worst fears. "The 3 men at the hotel are from a law firm in Denver," Frank reported. "They're representing someone who claims to have a legitimate interest in your uncle's estate. They're being cagey about details, but they've been asking very specific questions about mining claims and mineral rights." What kind of questions? The kind that suggests they know about the Colorado property, and possibly about other assets as well. Eli felt his stomach tighten. How could they know about that? Good question. Either Josiah told someone before he died, or these people have access to records we don't know about. Mining claims are public information if you know where to look. Frank pulled out a piece of paper covered with notes. I also learned some interesting things about your neighbor Brennan. Turns out he's been buying up properties throughout the valley for the past 5 years. Always pays cash, always offers more than the land seems worth. What's that got to do with anything? Maybe nothing. Or maybe someone's been planning this for a long time. Think about it. If you know there's treasure buried somewhere in this valley, the smart play is to control as much of the surrounding land as possible. The implications sent a chill through Eli. If Frank was right, then Brennan's interest in the homestead wasn't opportunistic. It was part of a larger strategy that had been in motion for years. You think Brennan knows about the treasure? I think Brennan knows something. Whether it's the treasure specifically or just that Josiah had hidden assets, I can't say. But his behavior suggests inside information. That night, Frank shared Eli's vigil, taking turns at watch while the other tried to sleep. Having backup made the darkness less threatening, but it also confirmed how serious their situation had become. During Frank's watch, he spotted movement near the tree line, at least 2 figures moving with the careful stealth of people who didn't want to be seen. They observed the homestead for over an hour before melting back into the shadows. We're being watched, Frank reported when Eli took over. Professional surveillance, not casual curiosity. What do they want? Information, confirmation. Maybe they're waiting for us to lead them to whatever they think we're hiding. Sunday brought another development that changed the stakes entirely. A well-dressed man arrived alone, riding a fine horse and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. He introduced himself as James Morrison, attorney at law from Denver, and requested a private conversation with Eli. Frank positioned himself where he could watch the approach road while Eli met with Morrison on the porch. Bo took up a position between them, alert to the tension in the air. Mr. Morgan, Morrison began, I represent parties who have a legitimate interest in your uncle's estate. We believe there may be assets that weren't properly inventoried during the probate process, such as mining properties for one thing. Your uncle held claims that may be quite valuable. There are also questions about certain financial instruments that weren't included in the will. Morrison's tone was professionally polite, but there was steel underneath. This wasn't a request. It was a warning disguised as a legal courtesy. I inherited everything my uncle owned, Eli said carefully. The will was quite specific about that. Wills can be challenged, Mr. Morgan, especially when there are questions about the deceased's mental competency or undue influence. Your uncle was quite elderly when he made his final arrangements. The threat was unmistakable. Morrison was suggesting that Eli's inheritance could be tied up in court for years if he didn't cooperate with whatever his clients wanted. What exactly are you proposing? Eli asked. A reasonable settlement. My clients are prepared to purchase your uncle's mining interests for fair market value. They're also willing to compensate you for any inconvenience this matter has caused. And if I'm not interested in selling? Morrison's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. Then I'm afraid this matter will have to be resolved through more formal legal proceedings. Probate challenges can be quite expensive and time-consuming, particularly for someone of limited means. After Morrison left, Frank emerged from his watching position with a grim expression. They're moving to the next phase, he said. The investigation is over. Now comes the pressure. What kind of pressure? The kind that starts with lawyers and ends with people getting hurt. We need to make some decisions, Eli, and we need to make them fast. The war for Josiah's legacy was escalating, and Eli realized they were running out of time to control how it would end. The revelation came from an unexpected source, arriving Monday morning in the form of a frail, elderly woman who rode up to the homestead in a buckboard driven by her grandson. She introduced herself as Martha Whitman, and her first words changed everything Eli thought he knew about his inheritance. "I need to tell you about your Uncle Josiah," she said without preamble, "and about the men who killed him." Eli and Frank exchanged glances, both recognizing the gravity in her tone. They helped her down from the buckboard and into the cabin, where she settled herself at the kitchen table with the deliberate movements of someone conserving limited strength. Martha Whitman was perhaps 70, with white hair pinned severely back and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd lived through hard times and learned from them. Her grandson, a young man named Peter, remained outside with instructions to watch for approaching riders. "Josiah didn't die of natural causes," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "He was murdered, and I can prove it." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. According to all official records, Josiah had died peacefully in his sleep, found by a neighbor when he failed to appear in town for supplies. The doctor had attributed his death to heart failure, a reasonable conclusion for a man in his 70s. "How do you know this?" Frank asked, his investigator's instincts taking over. Martha reached into her bag and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it carefully on the table. "Because Josiah came to me 2 weeks before he died. He was frightened, Mr. Morgan, afraid that people were closing in on him, and afraid of what would happen to his legacy if they succeeded." She opened the portfolio, revealing documents that made Eli's breath catch. Copies of all the papers he'd found in the buried chest, plus others he'd never seen. But more importantly, there was a detailed letter in Josiah's handwriting, dated just days before his death. "He knew they were coming for him," Martha continued. "He'd been getting pressure for months. Threats disguised as business propositions, men asking too many questions about his mining claims. So he made preparations." Frank leaned forward. "What kind of preparations?" "He made copies of everything important and gave them to me for safekeeping. He also told me the real story about where his wealth came from, and why certain people were so interested in getting their hands on it." Martha pulled out another document, a map hand-drawn by Josiah, showing not just his Colorado mining claim, but several others scattered across 3 territories. Each was marked with notations about production levels, estimated reserves, and current lease arrangements. "Your uncle wasn't just a successful miner, Mr. Morgan. He was a mining engineer who spent 20 years acquiring claims that other people thought were played out. He had the knowledge to see potential where others saw only worthless rock. But why would that get him killed?" Eli asked. "Because one of his claims, the big one in Colorado, sits directly on top of what may be the largest silver deposit ever discovered in North America. And certain powerful interests want to control that claim." She pointed to a spot on the map marked with red ink. "Josiah discovered a new vein just last year. His private assay showed ore so rich it would make whoever controlled it one of the wealthiest mining operations in the country. But instead of developing it himself, he was planning to sell his lease to the government." "The government?" Martha nodded grimly. "Josiah believed that kind of wealth should benefit the American people, not make a few individuals rich beyond measure. He was in negotiations with federal officials to transfer his claims to the U.S. Treasury in exchange for a reasonable payment and the guarantee that the silver would be used to stabilize the nation's currency." Frank was studying the documents with intense concentration. "Let me guess, certain private interests didn't appreciate his patriotic intentions." "Exactly. A consortium of wealthy investors had been pressuring him to sell privately for months. When he refused, the pressure became threats. When threats didn't work, they moved to more direct action." Martha's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "The night Josiah died, Peter was hunting rabbits near the homestead. He saw 3 men approach the cabin after dark. He heard shouting, sounds of a struggle, then silence. By the time he worked up courage to investigate, the men were gone, and Josiah was dead." "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Eli asked. "With what proof? 3 powerful lawyers against the word of a scared boy?" The doctor who examined Josiah's body was paid to find natural causes, and the sheriff was instructed not to ask inconvenient questions. The implications were staggering. Eli's uncle hadn't just been wealthy, He'd been sitting on a discovery that could affect the entire national economy. And he'd been murdered by people who were willing to kill to prevent that wealth from reaching government hands. Who are these people? Frank asked. Martha consulted another document from her portfolio. The Denver Mining Consortium, led by a man named Harrison Clark. He's got connections to politicians, judges, and business leaders throughout the territory. When he wants something, he usually gets it. And now he wants Josiah's claims, all of them, but especially the Colorado property. The lease expires next spring, and whoever controls the claim after that will control the silver. If Clark gets it, he'll become one of the most powerful men in America. If the government gets it, the consortium loses millions of dollars in potential profit. Eli felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. That's why they're pressuring me. They think I might honor Josiah's original intention to sell to the government. Exactly. They need to either convince you to sell to them or discredit your inheritance entirely. Either way, they get control of the claims. Frank was studying the map with tactical intensity. How much time do we have before the lease expires? 6 months, Martha replied. But the lease renewal process starts in 3 months. Whoever's going to make a claim needs to file paperwork with the territorial government by January 1st. The timeline suddenly made sense. The investigation, the pressure, the legal threats, everything was building toward a deadline that would determine control of unimaginable wealth. There's something else, Martha continued, her voice heavy with reluctance. Josiah suspected there was a traitor in the government negotiation. Someone who was feeding information to the consortium, telling them about his plans to sell to the Treasury. Do you know who? He had suspicions, but no proof. What he did know was that the consortium had detailed information about his assets, his legal position, even his personal habits. Someone with official access was helping them. This explained how Morrison and his clients knew so much about Josiah's holdings. They weren't just investigating from the outside, they had inside information from someone in a position of trust. Frank was examining the portfolio with the thoroughness of someone who understood its importance. Mrs. Whitman, why are you telling us this now? Why didn't you come forward immediately after Mr. Morgan inherited? Martha's expression grew troubled. Because I hoped the matter would die with Josiah. I thought if you just quietly lived on the homestead and didn't pursue the mining claims, the consortium might leave you alone. But when Peter told me about all the strangers asking questions, I realized they weren't going to give up. They're going to try to kill Eli too, Frank said bluntly. I'm afraid so, unless he gives them what they want, or unless we can prove what really happened to Josiah. Eli stared at the documents spread across his kitchen table, feeling the weight of history and responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his inheritance anymore. It was about justice for his murdered uncle and preventing a criminal conspiracy from succeeding. But it was also about something larger. If Josiah's vision was realized, the silver from his claims could help stabilize the nation's economy during uncertain times. If the consortium succeeded, that wealth would enrich a few powerful men while ordinary Americans continued to struggle. What do you want from me? He asked Martha. I want you to finish what Josiah started. Honor his intention to sell the claims to the government. But first, we need to prove he was murdered and identify everyone involved in the conspiracy. Frank was already thinking tactically. That means we need evidence, witnesses, and proof of the consortium's criminal activities. It also means we need to stay alive long enough to present that evidence to honest authorities. If there are any honest authorities, Eli said grimly. Martha smiled for the first time since her arrival. Oh, there are. Josiah spent months identifying federal officials who couldn't be bought. That's part of why the consortium was so desperate to stop him. She handed Eli a sealed envelope from her portfolio. Names and contact information for Treasury Department investigators who were working with Josiah. If we can get evidence to them, they have the authority to pursue a federal case. Outside, Peter's whistle warned of approaching riders. Through the window, they could see a group of 6 men heading toward the homestead, led by Thomas Brennan and including several faces Eli didn't recognize. "Time to put our plans into action," Frank said, checking his weapons. But Eli was thinking about something else. For the first time since finding the treasure, he understood what he was really fighting for. This wasn't about his own wealth or security. It was about honor, justice, and the kind of legacy a man left behind. Josiah had died protecting something larger than himself. Now it was Eli's turn to prove he was worthy of that inheritance. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Brennan's group stopped 50 yards from the cabin, arranged in a semicircle that suggested military training and hostile intentions. Frank positioned himself at the front window, while Eli moved to cover the back door. Martha gathered her documents and retreated to the root cellar with Peter, taking the evidence that could prove Josiah's murder. "Morgan!" Brennan's voice carried across the yard with authority born of years commanding other men. "We need to talk." Eli stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. Poe took position beside him, hackles raised and teeth bared, in the first display of aggression Eli had ever seen from the normally gentle dog. "I'm listening." "This has gone far enough. You've got something that doesn't belong to you, and we're here to collect it. Everything I have came to me legal and proper." Brennan spurred his horse closer, close enough that Eli could see the cold calculation in his eyes. The other riders spread out slightly, creating overlapping fields of fire that spoke of professional planning. "Legal's a matter of interpretation," Brennan called back. "Sometimes legal and right aren't the same thing." The negotiation continued for several tense minutes, both sides probing for advantage while avoiding the commitment of open violence. But Eli could see that Brennan was stalling, keeping them focused on the front of the property while something else developed behind them. Frank's warning whistle from inside the cabin confirmed his suspicions. More riders were approaching from the north, cutting off potential escape routes and surrounding the homestead. Whatever Brennan was planning, it involved overwhelming force and no witnesses. "Last chance, Morgan." Brennan's patience was clearly exhausted. "Hand over Josiah's papers and anything else you found, and we'll let you ride away with your life. And if I refuse, then we'll take what we came for anyway, and you won't be around to complain about it." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder charge. Eli felt time slowing, his senses sharpening the way they had during combat situations in his army days. Every detail became crystal clear, the way afternoon light slanted across the yard, the nervous movements of Brennan's horse, the careful positioning of armed men who were preparing for violence. But before either side could escalate to shooting, another group of riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. 7 men in federal uniforms, led by someone carrying a badge that caught the sunlight. Martha's whistle from the root cellar was triumphant, her message to the Treasury. Investigators had gotten through. Federal agents descended into the valley with the measured pace of people who held legal authority and weren't afraid to use it. Their leader, a stern-faced man with sergeant's stripes and the bearing of someone who'd seen combat, rode directly between the two confronting groups. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Hayes, Treasury Department," he announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "By order of the federal government, everyone here is to stand down immediately." Brennan's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty as he realized the situation had changed dramatically. Federal agents meant federal jurisdiction, and federal jurisdiction meant his local connections and influence carried no weight. "Marshal, this is a local property dispute," he called out, trying to maintain control of the narrative. "Nothing that concerns federal authorities." "Murder of a federal informant concerns us very much," Hayes replied, producing a warrant from his jacket. Josiah Morgan was working with the Treasury Department on matters of national economic importance. His death is being investigated as a federal crime. The words hit Brennan like physical blows. His face went pale as he realized that everything his consortium had worked for was collapsing around him. Worse, his own involvement in the conspiracy was now a matter of federal investigation. Hayes continued with relentless precision. Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, interference with federal investigations, and attempted theft of federal assets. Anyone who interferes with this arrest will be charged accordingly." The standoff dissolved into chaos as several of Brennan's men tried to escape, while others debated whether to fight or surrender. But the federal agents had anticipated resistance, and more riders appeared from multiple directions, cutting off retreat routes and surrounding the entire area. Frank emerged from the cabin as the situation stabilized, his own weapons holstered now that proper authority had arrived. Eli felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Martha's plan had worked, and the conspiracy was finally being exposed to official scrutiny. But the day's revelations weren't finished. As Brennan was being placed under arrest, one of his men, a nervous young rider named Collins, suddenly broke ranks and rode toward the federal agents with his hands raised in surrender. "I want to make a deal," he shouted. "I've got information about who's really behind this." Marshal Hayes gestured for his men to allow Collins to approach. The young man dismounted with shaking hands, clearly terrified but determined to save himself from the fate awaiting his companions. "It's not just Brennan," Collins said rapidly. "He's working for bigger people, important people in Denver and Washington. They've got judges bought, politicians in their pocket, even people in the territorial government." Hayes listened with the patient attention of someone gathering evidence for a major prosecution. "What kind of people?" "Harrison Clark's the main one, but he's got partners. Banking people, railroad people, even someone high up in the territorial administration who's been feeding them information." The magnitude of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Josiah's mining claims. It was about a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. "Who's the federal contact?" Hayes asked quietly. Collins looked around nervously, as if afraid the wrong person might overhear. "Someone in the land office in Helena. Man named Davidson, handles mineral rights and claim transfers. He's been giving them advance information about federal purchases and government mineral surveys." Eli felt a chill of recognition. Davidson was the official who would process any transfer of Josiah's claims to the federal government. If he was working with the consortium, then Josiah's murder had been part of a larger plan to control the entire process. Hayes was making notes in a leather portfolio, recording Collins's testimony with official thoroughness. "What about the murder itself? Who actually killed Josiah Morgan?" "3 men from Denver. Professional killers hired by Clark's organization. They made it look natural, but it was planned months in advance." The confession continued for nearly an hour, with Collins providing names, dates, and details that painted a picture of systematic criminal conspiracy. By the time he finished, it was clear that Josiah's murder was just one element in a much larger scheme to control Montana's mineral wealth. As the federal agents organized their prisoners and evidence, Martha emerged from the root cellar with Peter and the documents that had triggered the entire investigation. She approached Marshal Hayes with the dignity of someone who'd spent weeks planning this moment. "Marshal Hayes, I believe you'll find these documents confirm everything Mr. Collins has told you," she said, handing over Josiah's portfolio. "My late friend was very thorough in his record-keeping." Hayes examined the papers with professional interest, occasionally asking Martha for clarification about specific details. When he finished, his expression was grim but satisfied. "Mrs. Whitman, these documents provide crucial evidence for a federal prosecution. With Mr. Collins's testimony and this paper trail, we can build a case that reaches all the way to Washington." "What about Eli's inheritance?" she asked. "Will the federal government honor Josiah's intention to transfer the mining claims? That will be determined through proper legal channels, but I can tell you that the Treasury Department is very interested in acquiring those silver reserves. If Mr. Morgan is willing to negotiate in good faith, I believe we can reach an arrangement that honors both his legal rights and his uncle's patriotic intentions." As the sun set over the valley, Eli found himself standing on his porch with Bo beside him, watching federal agents escort prisoners toward town. The battle was over, But the war for Josiah's legacy had been won through legal rather than violent means. Frank joined him on the porch, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. "Well, partner, looks like you're going to be a wealthy man after all, and a living one, which is always preferable. Think they'll honor the deal Josiah was trying to make? The feds? Probably. They want that silver for currency stabilization, and they need to show that working with the government pays better than opposing it. You'll get fair value, plus you'll have the satisfaction of knowing you completed your uncle's work." Eli looked out over the homestead that had brought him so much trouble and unexpected purpose. The buildings were still in need of repair, the land still required considerable work, but it felt like home in a way that no place ever had before. "You staying around?" he asked Frank for a while. "Government's going to need witnesses for the trials, and I suspect there'll be more complications before this is all settled. Besides," Frank added with a rare smile, "someone needs to help you figure out what to do with $10 million. Bo stretched and settled down between them, finally relaxed now that the danger had passed. The dog had fulfilled his duty to Josiah's memory, had helped guide the treasure to its rightful owner, and seen justice done for his master's murder. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, negotiations with federal officials, legal proceedings against the conspiracy, and the complex process of converting Josiah's hidden wealth into something useful for the future. But tonight, Eli was content to sit on his porch with his dog and his oldest friend, knowing that he'd proven worthy of the inheritance that had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later, not with gunfire and violence, but in the paneled courtroom of the federal courthouse in Helena. Eli sat at the prosecutor's table, wearing his one good suit, feeling more nervous than he'd been during any of the armed standoffs at the Homestead. Beside him, Martha Whitman reviewed her testimony notes, while Marshal Hayes conferred quietly with the federal prosecutor. Across the aisle, Harrison Clark sat with his team of expensive lawyers, projecting the confidence of a man who'd spent decades manipulating legal systems to his advantage. He was older than Eli had expected, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. But there was something desperate in his eyes that suggested he understood how much was at stake. The courtroom was packed with spectators drawn by newspaper accounts of the conspiracy. Local ranchers sat alongside federal officials. Territorial politicians rubbed shoulders with mining engineers, and reporters scribbled notes from seats reserved for the press. This wasn't just a criminal trial. It was a public reckoning with corruption that had infected territorial government for years. Judge Harrison, no relation to the defendant, as he'd carefully noted, called the court to order with the gravity appropriate to federal charges that could reshape Montana's political landscape. He was a thin man with penetrating eyes and a reputation for fairness that even Clark's lawyers couldn't challenge. The United States of America versus Harrison Clark and Associates, the clerk announced. Charges include conspiracy to commit murder, interference with federal investigations, bribery of federal officials, and attempted theft of federal assets. The prosecutor, a young man named Patterson, who'd traveled from Washington specifically for this case, rose to address the jury. His opening statement painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached from mining camps to the nation's capital. "Gentlemen of the jury, this case concerns more than the murder of one man, though that crime alone would justify your serious attention. This case concerns an assault on the integrity of American institutions, an attempt to subvert federal authority for private profit, and a conspiracy that threatened the economic stability of our nation." Patterson walked the jury through the evidence methodically: Josiah's documents, Collins's testimony, financial records that showed payments from Clark's organization to territorial officials, even correspondence between Clark and politicians in Washington. The picture that emerged was of a criminal enterprise operating at the highest levels of government. When Patterson called Eli to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Here was the man at the center of the conspiracy, the reluctant heir whose discovery of buried treasure had exposed years of criminal activity. "Mr. Morgan, please tell the court about your relationship with your uncle Josiah," Eli spoke clearly, describing his inheritance and the discovery of the treasure. But more importantly, he testified about Josiah's character, his integrity, his patriotism, his belief that great wealth carried great responsibility. "My uncle could have sold his claims to private interests and become one of the richest men in America," Eli said, looking directly at the jury. Instead, he chose to serve his country, even though he knew that choice might cost him his life. Clark's lead attorney, a man named Pemberton, with the polished manner of someone who specialized in defending wealthy criminals, tried to discredit Eli during cross-examination. "Mr. Morgan, isn't it true that you're a simple cowhand with no education or experience in business matters? How can this court trust your interpretation of complex financial documents?" "You're right that I'm not educated in business," Eli replied calmly. "But I can read and I can recognize the difference between right and wrong. My uncle's papers were clear about his intentions, and those intentions were honorable. But you stand to profit enormously if the federal government accepts his proposal. Doesn't that give you a powerful motive to misrepresent the facts?" Eli considered the question carefully before answering. "Sir, I've been poor my whole life, and I've been rich for the past month. I can tell you that money changes some things, but it doesn't change what a man owes to his family and his country. If honoring my uncle's wishes makes me wealthy, I'm grateful. But if it just makes me right, I'm satisfied." The answer drew murmurs of approval from the gallery, and Eli could see several jury members nodding in agreement. Pemberton tried a few more approaches, but it was clear that Eli's simple honesty was more persuasive than legal maneuvering. Martha's testimony was devastating to the defense. She presented Josiah's papers with the authority of someone who'd spent years organizing community efforts, walking the jury through evidence that proved premeditation and conspiracy. When Pemberton tried to suggest that her testimony was motivated by friendship rather than facts, she fixed him with a stare that could have melted iron. "Young man, I've buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children. I know the difference between sentiment and truth. Josiah Morgan was murdered by your client's agents, and these documents prove it. But the most damaging testimony came from Collins, who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence." Speaking with the nervous energy of someone whose life depended on telling the truth, he detailed conversations with Clark himself about eliminating the Josiah problem permanently. "Mr. Clark said the old man was being stubborn about the greater good," Collins testified. "He said sometimes you had to remove obstacles to progress, and Josiah was definitely an obstacle." As the testimony continued, Eli found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this courtroom. 6 months ago, he'd been a broke cowhand with no prospects and no hope. Now he was the key witness in a federal conspiracy trial, the heir to a fortune that could change his life forever, and the guardian of his uncle's dream for a more honest America. The transformation went deeper than wealth or social position. For the first time in his adult life, Eli felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Whether that was continuing Josiah's work, exposing corruption, or simply proving that ordinary men could stand up to powerful interests, he couldn't say. But he knew with absolute certainty that this was his fight, and he was going to see it through to the end. The trial's decisive moment came when Prosecutor Patterson called Davidson to the stand. The land office official who'd been feeding information to Clark's conspiracy arrived in shackles, having been arrested the previous week when federal agents raided his Helena office. His appearance was that of a broken man, hollow-eyed, unshaven, and clearly terrified of the consequences of his cooperation with criminals. Davidson's testimony unraveled the conspiracy with devastating precision. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, He admitted to providing Clark with advance notice of Josiah's negotiations with the Treasury Department, detailed information about federal mineral surveys, and even copies of confidential correspondence between government officials. Mr. Clark paid me $5,000 for each piece of information, Davidson testified, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He said it was just business intelligence, nothing illegal. But when he asked me to delay processing Mr. Morgan's inheritance papers, I knew something was wrong. Patterson pressed for details. What kind of delay? He wanted me to find technical problems with the documentation, reasons to question the validity of the will, anything that would give his lawyers time to file challenges or find other ways to contest the inheritance. The courtroom stirred as the implications became clear. Clark hadn't just been trying to pressure Eli into selling. He'd been systematically undermining his legal position through corrupt federal officials. Did Mr. Clark ever discuss violence against Josiah Morgan? Davidson hesitated, clearly understanding that his answer would determine whether he faced years in prison or the hangman's noose. He said the old man needed to be neutralized before he could complete his deal with the government. I thought he meant legally, through courts or political pressure. I didn't know he meant murder. Clark's lawyer objected vigorously, but the damage was done. The jury had heard a federal official admit to taking bribes and facilitating what he knew was a criminal conspiracy. When Clark himself finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was a masterpiece of arrogance and denial. He portrayed himself as a legitimate businessman who'd been victimized by overzealous federal prosecutors and lying witnesses seeking reduced sentences. I have spent 30 years building mining operations that employ thousands of Americans, he declared with the conviction of someone who'd convinced himself of his own righteousness. Every dollar I've earned has been through honest business practices and legitimate investments. Patterson's cross-examination cut through Clark's self-justification like a knife through butter. Armed with documents seized during federal raids, he presented evidence of bribes, threats, and criminal conspiracy that Clark couldn't explain away. Mr. Clark, can you explain this payment of $10,000 to operational expenses made the same week Josiah Morgan died? Routine business costs. What about this telegram instructing your associates to resolve the Montana situation permanently? I was referring to legal resolution through proper channels. And this letter where you write, "The old man won't be a problem much longer"? Clark's composure finally cracked. You're taking everything out of context. I never ordered anyone killed, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's faces showed they weren't buying Clark's denials. When Patterson finished his methodical destruction of Clark's credibility, even the defendant's expensive lawyers seemed to understand that their case was hopeless. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their foreman, a grizzled rancher named Peterson, who'd spent his life evaluating men and their motives, delivered the verdict with solemn finality. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of bribery of federal officials, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of interference with federal investigations, we find the defendant guilty. The litany continued through all charges, each guilty verdict hitting Clark like a physical blow. By the time Peterson finished, the man who'd tried to steal Josiah's legacy was slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his wealth and connections couldn't save him from the consequences of his crimes. Judge Harrison's sentencing was swift and harsh. Mr. Clark, you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the heart of American justice. Your actions have corrupted federal officials, resulted in the murder of a patriotic citizen, and threatened the economic stability of our nation. I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As federal marshals led Clark away in chains, Eli felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Josiah back or undo the suffering the conspiracy had caused. Outside the courthouse, Martha Whitman approached Eli with tears in her eyes. Josiah would be proud, she said simply. You honored his memory and completed his work. Frank joined them on the courthouse steps, where reporters were already gathering to interview the key witnesses. So what now, partner? You're officially rich, and the bad guys are in prison. Time to enjoy the fruits of victory? Eli looked out over Helena's busy streets, thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been nobody special, just another aging cowhand with no prospects and no purpose. Now he was wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but more importantly, he'd discovered something about himself that all the treasure in the world couldn't buy. I think, he said slowly, it's time to go home and figure out what kind of man I want to be with all this responsibility. The legal battle was over. But Eli's real journey was just beginning. He had a fortune to manage, a legacy to honor, and a future to build. But most importantly, he had Bo waiting for him at the homestead, loyal and patient as always, ready to help his master navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. The boy who'd grown up poor in Missouri had become a man who could stand up to powerful criminals and win. Now it remained to be seen what kind of wealthy man he would become, and how he would use his unexpected inheritance to honor both his uncle's memory and his own hard-won principles. 2 years later, Eli Morgan stood on the same porch where he'd first met Bo, watching the sun set over a valley that looked much the same, but felt completely different. The homestead bore little resemblance to the ramshackle place he'd inherited. The cabin had been rebuilt from the foundation up, the barn stood straight and strong, and the root cellar had been expanded into a proper storage facility. But the changes went far deeper than mere improvements. Bo, now grayer around the muzzle but still alert and dignified, dozed in his favorite spot beside Eli's chair. The dog had earned his retirement, having served faithfully as guardian of two masters' secrets and witness to the transformation of both their lives. These days, his main responsibility was supervising the construction. Crews and ranch hands who'd turned the Homestead into a working operation again. The negotiations with the federal government had taken 8 months to complete, but the final agreement honored both Josiah's intentions and Eli's rights as heir. The Treasury Department had purchased the most valuable mining claims for their full appraised worth, nearly $7 million, while allowing Eli to retain ownership of several smaller properties that provided ongoing income. The silver from Josiah's main claim was already helping stabilize the nation's currency, just as the old man had hoped. But wealth, Eli had learned, brought responsibilities he'd never anticipated. He'd established a school in Copper Falls, endowed a hospital in Helena, and funded improvements to roads and bridges throughout the territory. It seemed fitting that Josiah's treasure, discovered through the loyalty of a faithful dog, should be used to build the kind of community where ordinary people could prosper. Frank had stayed on as Eli's business manager and security advisor, bringing his investigative skills to bear on investment opportunities and potential threats. He'd also married the schoolteacher in Copper Falls, a widow named Catherine who'd won his heart with her combination of intelligence and kindness. They lived in a house Eli had built for them in town, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough away to maintain their independence. "Penny for your thoughts," Frank said, joining Eli on the porch after his weekly visit to review business matters. "Just thinking about changes," Eli replied. 2 years ago, people laughed at me for inheriting a broken-down place and an old dog. Now they come to me for advice about everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. Funny how money changes people's opinions about your intelligence. It's not the money, though. It's what the money represents, proof that ordinary folks can make something of themselves if they get the right chance. Frank settled into the chair beside him, accepting a cup of coffee from the pot that always seemed to be warming on the stove. "You've changed too, you know. Not just your circumstances, but something fundamental about how you carry yourself." Eli considered that. "I suppose finding out you can stand up to powerful people when it matters tends to adjust a man's perspective. It's more than that. You've got purpose now, something bigger than just getting by from day to day." The observation was accurate. Eli had spent most of his adult life simply surviving, moving from job to job without any larger vision of what he wanted to accomplish. Now he woke each morning with specific goals, letters to write, projects to oversee, people to help. The wealth had given him options, but more importantly, it had given him the confidence to believe his actions could make a difference. A rider appeared on the Western Trail, approaching at the easy pace of someone bringing good news rather than trouble. As the figure drew closer, Eli recognized Sarah Henderson, the lawyer who'd advised him during those first uncertain weeks. She'd become more than just legal counsel over the past 2 years. She was now territorial counsel for mining affairs and one of the few people Eli trusted completely with sensitive matters. Evening. "Sarah," Eli called as she dismounted. "Business or social visit?" "Both," she replied, accepting Frank's offer to tend her horse. "I've got news about the federal investigation, and I thought you'd want to hear it directly." They gathered around the kitchen table where so many important conversations had taken place. Sarah opened her portfolio with the professional efficiency that had served Eli so well during the legal proceedings. "The last of Clark's associates was sentenced today," she reported. "Davidson got 15 years, the 3 hired killers got life, and 2 territorial officials were removed from office and fined everything they owned. Justice served," Frank said with satisfaction. "More than that," Sarah continued. "The federal reforms triggered by this case have cleaned up corruption throughout the territorial government. President Cleveland himself signed new regulations requiring public disclosure of all mineral transactions and federal oversight of territorial land offices." Eli felt a deep satisfaction hearing this. Josiah's death had exposed a network of corruption that might have continued for years, affecting countless honest citizens who depended on fair treatment from their government. "There's something else," Sarah added, her tone becoming more personal. "I've been offered a position with the Department of Justice in Washington. They want me to head up a new division focused on territorial corruption cases." "Congratulations," Eli said, meaning it. "You've earned the recognition. The thing is, they want to base the division in Helena rather than Washington. Keep it close to where the problems are most likely to occur. I'd be working on cases throughout the Western Territories, but Montana would be home base." Frank leaned forward with interest. "That means you'd be staying in the territory?" "If I take the job. But before I decide, I wanted to ask what you think, Eli. This investigation started with your courage to do the right thing despite personal danger. I'd value your opinion about whether this kind of work is worth pursuing." Eli looked out the window at the valley where his transformation had begun. In the distance, he could see lights from the Henderson place, where the family continued their quiet work of building a life on land they'd farmed for decades. Closer to town, other lights marked the homes of people who'd benefited from the school, the hospital, and the other improvements funded by Josiah's legacy. "I think," he said slowly, "that ordinary people deserve to know their government works for them, not against them. If you can help make that happen, it seems like worthy work to me." Sarah smiled, the decision apparently made. "Then I suppose I'll be staying in Montana." As the evening wound down and his guests prepared to leave, Eli found himself thinking about the strange circularity of his story. He'd started as a man with nothing, inherited what seemed like a cruel joke, and ended up wealthy beyond imagination. But the real treasure hadn't been the gold and silver buried in his yard. It had been the discovery of what he was capable of when circumstances demanded his best. Bo stirred beside his chair, stretching with the careful movements of an aging dog who'd earned the right to comfort. Eli scratched behind the dog's ears, remembering that morning 2 years ago when Bo had first started digging in the yard. "You knew all along, didn't you, boy? You knew what was buried out there, and you knew it would change everything." Bo's tail wagged once, slowly, and Eli chose to interpret that as agreement. The dog had been the bridge between Josiah's intentions and Eli's inheritance, the faithful guardian who'd preserved a secret until the right person came along to claim it. Outside, The wind picked up, rustling through grass that grew green and thick now that the land was properly tended. But inside the sturdy cabin, Eli felt the deep contentment that came from work well done and responsibilities faithfully met. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There always were new challenges when a man tried to use wealth responsibly. But tonight, sitting on his own porch with his own dog beside his own fire, Eli Morgan was exactly where he belonged. The boy who'd grown up poor had become a man who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in gold and silver, but in the difference one person could make when they had the courage to stand up for what was right. And in the end, that was a treasure worth more than anything that could be buried in the ground.